Nuclear energy. What does it mean to you?
In my generation, people in many cases think that it's a bad thing, but then they really don't know what to do about it, and they tend to, worry and then say, oh, it's not my problem, but then it is.
How safe do you think it really is?
Well, I think I'd rather spill a little antifreeze in the ground than spill a little nuclear waste in the neighborhood. I don't think you should just trust that kind of dangerous chemicals to mechanical parts like that, because mechanical parts will always fail. And
what do you think we should do with the waste?
The way that they're storing this waste and the way that it's polluting the air is soon gonna just wipe out everything, because there's, highly toxic fumes and radioactive waste that's being put into the water, into the air.
What is your connection to nuclear racism?
The waste is just put out into an empty space where communities nearby live, and all the waste is just going to sit there for millions and millions of years because nobody really knows what to do with it.
Can we afford it?
I don't think it's all that cheap, because we seem to be paying for it with our health and the health of our great-great-grandchildren.
These high school students are not far off. Welcome to Good Nukes, Almost Good Enough, a production of the Prairie Island Coalition. This title is inspired by a senior Northern States Power Company nuclear engineer who told a colleague that due to design and materials flaws, key parts in reactors like Prairie Island are, quote, no better than almost good enough, end of quote. There are over 100 commercial reactors operating in the United States. About 2/3 of these, including Prairie Island, are pressurized water reactors. There are 14 operating reactor sites in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Wisconsin. The Prairie Island reactors and nuclear waste storage facility are located 45 miles southeast of Minneapolis-St. Paul on the Mississippi River. Both are immediately adjacent to the Prairie Island, Mdewakanton, Dakota community. The two reactors each have a generating capacity of 530 megawatts and began producing electricity in 1973 and 1974. Nuclear energy accounts for about 25% of the electricity used in Minnesota and about 30% of the electricity produced by NSP. Society's dependence on nuclear energy creates 5 fundamental problems: broken reactor components, routine nuclear emissions, no safe way to manage nuclear waste, nuclear racism, and bad nuclear economics. To understand the threat created by broken reactor parts, one must basically know how reactors like Prairie Island work. They use a 3-loop water system to produce electricity and nuclear waste. Heat in the reactor core comes from a chain reaction of exploding uranium atoms. In the core, primary water is heated above 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot primary water is pumped through steam generators, where heat is transferred to secondary water that flashes into steam. Primary water returns to the core for reheating. Very high pressure keeps primary water from boiling. Prairie Island has 4 steam generators, 2 for each reactor. Each is about 25 feet tall and contains over 3,000 tubes. Secondary water outside the tubes boils. The resulting steam spins turbines to generate electricity. Then, secondary steam is condensed and returned to steam generators. Less than 1/3 of the energy in the core emerges as electricity. The rest of the energy is removed as waste heat in the condenser and sent to the river and atmosphere. Problems with steam generator tubes now cause major public health and safety risks. NSP was the 13th electric utility to sue Westinghouse because steam generator tubes sold by Westinghouse have experienced unanticipated and premature degradation. This degradation causes cracks to form and grow and leak primary water into the secondary loop. It can cause tubes to rupture. Internal nuclear industry documents secured by the Prairie Island Coalition during NSP's lawsuit emphasize the seriousness of tube cracking. This steam generator diagram identifies some of the tube problems. Tube degradation tends to concentrate in the following areas: where tubes are welded to the tube sheet at the bottom of the steam generator, where tubes pass through support plates, where interior tubes are bent tightly near the top of the steam generator, where sludge piles accumulate around the tubes. Stress and corrosion cause pits, pinholes, and two types of tube cracks. Axial cracks run the tube length. Circumferential cracks run around the tube. In addition, foreign objects left inside steam generators during inspection and repair can rub and bang against tubes until they rupture. New cracks are occurring in ways the nuclear industry doesn't understand and can't predict. For example, cracks are appearing in mid-span regions in between support plates where there is no ready explanation for their presence. We now know that steam generators were poorly designed and made out of the wrong metal. Crevices where corrosion readily occurs are inherent in vertical steam generator designs. And Inconel, the nickel-chromium alloy used to make the tubes, is more susceptible to crevice corrosion cracking than stainless steel. To quote the senior NSP nuclear engineer who inspired our title, "So, if we are stuck on Inconel and stuck with crevices, then it is virtually a given that we will end up with steam generators that are no better than almost good enough." The nuclear industry does not know how to stop the global epidemic of tube cracking. Steam generator leakage can't be prevented. Tube defects cause all steam generators to leak all the time. Even when reactors first come back online after being down for repairs, tubes still leak. There have been 14 tube ruptures in the United States, including a rupture at Prairie Island in October of 1979. At first, leaking tubes were plugged and taken out of service. But there is a limit to how many tubes can be plugged before performance suffers. So, many plugs have been removed and a smaller tube or sleeve gets welded inside the original tube. Unfortunately, sleeves and plugs soon leak as well. The trend of steam generator tube defects at Prairie Island is consistent with the national pattern. As of October 1996, the 4 Prairie Island steam generators had almost 600 tubes plugged. Without plugging, each of these tubes could have ruptured. On February 27, 1996, after the Prairie Island Coalition had secured internal nuclear industry documentation of steam generator tube problems, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission confirmed our worst fear. Steam generator tube degradation is increasingly likely to result in many tubes rupturing at the same time. This will cause a nuclear meltdown. Of particular concern are circumferential cracks in tubes next to each other. When one circumferentially cracked tube ruptures, the additional stress may cause adjacent tubes to also rupture. Rules governing reactor operations simply did not contemplate cascading tube ruptures. Therefore, emergency core cooling systems were not designed to prevent a core meltdown if a number of tubes rupture at the same time. During a cascading tube rupture, radioactive primary water will flash into steam in the secondary water loop. Steam line pressure relief valves outside the containment vessel will open and vent radioactive steam to the atmosphere. As primary water hemorrhages into the secondary loop, primary water pressure will drop. This will cause water in the core to boil. Steam pressure inside the core will force water out, and the core, no longer cooled by water, will melt. Molten fuel will collect at the bottom of the reactor vessel and melt down through the floor and into the ground beneath. This has been called the China syndrome. During a meltdown, it is virtually certain that molten fuel will contact groundwater under the plant. Resulting steam explosions will spread radioactive fuel particles throughout a wide area. Millions of people could be contaminated. This map shows the area contaminated by one type of radioactive particle from the Chernobyl explosion. This deposition pattern totally depended on weather conditions at the time of the explosion. Additional radioactivity contaminated much of the globe, including Sami land in northern Scandinavia, where reindeer herds were exterminated after they ate contaminated lichens. A Chernobyl-type explosion cannot happen at Prairie Island, but a cascading tube rupture event could not have happened at Chernobyl. The technologies are different. Each nuclear technology, however, is susceptible to catastrophic accidents. Cascading tube ruptures at Prairie Island could contaminate an area similar to the size of the contaminated zone surrounding Chernobyl. Here, the area contaminated by this one type of radiation from Chernobyl is overlaid on a map centered on Prairie Island. These maps are on the same scale. A cascading tube rupture event at Prairie Island could contaminate an area this size. Evacuation and abandonment will be the only emergency response, and we are ill-equipped for even a safe evacuation. We are all in the zone. Cascading tube ruptures are only one of a number of possible events that could cause a meltdown at Prairie Island or any other nuclear reactor. Even if steam generator tubes didn't leak and threaten catastrophe, nuclear plants still endanger our health. During normal reactor operations, radioactive substances are routinely produced and released to the environment. These releases are significant. Prior to 1940, less than 40 curies of radioactive material had been isolated on Earth. Now, Prairie Island releases over 500 curies of tritium into the Mississippi River every year. It releases an additional 200 curies per year of airborne radioactivity. These radioactive particles are out there in our environment where they can be ingested and inhaled. But radiation monitoring is not designed to detect this radioactivity. Public officials have no idea where radioactive emissions go or where they concentrate. And when the area surrounding the reactors floods, longer-lived radioactive material deposited on soil since previous flooding gets flushed into the river where it causes more harm. Tritium is a radioactive form of hydrogen that is produced in the reactor core. NSP releases tritium into the river where it replaces hydrogen in water. Tritium in water that is ingested will cause continuous internal low-level radiation exposure over a long period. Other routine radioactive emissions that get inside the body through ingestion and inhalation include cesium-137, iodine-131, and strontium-90. Strontium mimics calcium. It collects in bones where radiation can reach the marrow, an important part of the immune system. Cesium resembles sodium and migrates to fatty tissue. Radioactive iodine concentrates in the thyroid gland, which is also integral to the immune system. Once radioactive material gets inside the body, comparisons with background radiation levels are meaningless. Background radiation is outside body shielding. But living tissue next to internal sources is not shielded. It is vulnerable and gets damaged or destroyed. Radiation creates positive and negative ions, red and blue respectively, as it passes through matter. These ions kill living tissue. The electrical charge of an ion breaks the bond that holds together the molecules that form cell walls. As cell walls dissolve, tissues die, and the door is open for cancers, mutations, and other diseases. High-level radiation bursts, such as X-ray dosages, create many positive and negative ions. These opposite charges all tend to attract and neutralize each other, thereby becoming non-toxic. Ions that are not neutralized do their damage, but then the radiation burst is over, and the body's repair mechanisms begin the healing process. Low-level radiation, however, creates relatively few ions. Few opposite charges are available to attract each other, so there is little neutralization. Each ion, therefore, passes from one molecule to the next. As it goes, it continues breaking bonds that hold cell walls together. This destructive efficiency causes low-level radiation exposure to result in damage that is more than 1,000 times worse than the damage caused by the same amount of radiation concentrated in a high-level burst. Dr. Abram Petkow, a Canadian scientist, found that due to this efficiency, the amount of damage done by low-level exposure is dependent on the length of time living tissue spends in the radiation field, not on the relative radiation field's strength. As internal radiation pulses never stop, damage is continuous. There is no chance to heal. The destructive efficiency of continuous internal low-level exposure may explain why women living near nuclear plants experience elevated breast cancer mortality. Dr. Gould, a statistician and director of the Radiation and Public Health Project, and Dr. Sternglass, professor emeritus of radiology at the University of Pittsburgh Medical School, examined National Cancer Institute data. They found, for example, that the rate of breast cancer in counties near nuclear plants was higher than in other counties, enough higher to account for over 17,000 deaths in 5 years. Nuclear power plants produce nuclear waste. Waste fuel assemblies must be removed from the reactor core after they lose efficiency. The waste must be placed in a pool next to the reactor for at least 5 years due to intense heat and radioactivity. Direct exposure to radiation from a single rod of this waste for a small fraction of a second would kill an unprotected person standing anywhere nearby. But the pool at the Prairie Island nuclear plant quickly filled, and twice NSP increased the pool capacity by packing the waste assemblies closer together. Then, in 1989, NSP applied to federal and state agencies to again increase nuclear waste storage capacity. Their proposal? Store waste outside the plant in 48 steel casks on a concrete pad. After a bitter fight in 1994, the Minnesota legislature gave NSP permission to fill up to 17 casks. As of March 5, 1998, 7 casks are loaded with high-level nuclear waste on Prairie Island. These casks cannot be transported. Before waste in these casks can leave Prairie Island, it must be unloaded and put in transport casks. Casks that are not unloaded within 20 years must be resealed to prevent fuel assemblies from rapid disintegration. To reseal or unload a storage cask, it must be put back in the pool and refilled with water for radiation and heat protection. Because the fuel will still be extremely hot, pool water contacting the hot fuel will flash into steam. The steam must be vented. But there is no technology or procedure that can adequately vacuum and filter radioactive gases and particles from the vented steam. Cool water on hot metal could also cause damage to fragile waste assemblies. The assemblies may disintegrate and cause the waste to fall to the bottom of the cask in a pattern that goes critical. Casks must be unloaded, or else they must be maintained. Either way, they must go back into the pool. In other words, unavoidable and essential cask maintenance and operating procedures may themselves result in massive radiation releases. Currently, the only site being considered by the United States for permanently storing high-level nuclear waste is at Yucca Mountain, Nevada. Yucca Mountain is not a good place for a nuclear waste repository. The region has active volcanoes and earthquakes. Since an earthquake in 1992, the water table under the mountain fluctuates quite dramatically. Humidity inside the mountain is above 80%. Steam produced by heat from the waste could blow Yucca Mountain apart. Water migrates rapidly through the mountain, and the sides of the tunnel inside the mountain tend to crumble. Crystals found in the tunnel could only have been formed in the presence of high-pressure geothermally heated water. An upwelling of superpressurized water through the repository could kill people all across the country. But the nuclear industry is desperate to ship waste from reactor sites now and wants to send it to a parking lot next to Yucca Mountain. Legislation to accomplish this passed Congress in 1997. President Clinton has promised a veto. Transporting this waste would require 15,000 to 45,000 shipments over the next 30 years. This would create a host of very troubling public health and security problems. And if Yucca Mountain does not accept the waste, it would have to be shipped again to somewhere else. The only purpose for this legislation, called Mobile Chernobyl by opponents, is to enable the nuclear industry to produce more nuclear waste. Security problems are not limited to nuclear waste transportation. A private commercial pilot took this picture. Existing security at reactor sites is for public relations purposes only. Quote, "Nuclear energy and its waste were created in arrogance and corruption, and continue to expand power of wealth and corruption throughout the entire world by the sacrifice of people of color upon its unholy altar." Unquote. Rufina Marie Laws, Mescalero Apache. Without nuclear racism, there would be no nuclear energy. Nuclear energy targets people of color for the mining, milling, and processing of uranium and the storage of radioactive wastes. Most uranium mining and milling occur on Hopi and Navajo lands in the southwest United States, on Cree lands in northern Canada, on Aboriginal homelands of Australia, and on tribal homelands in South Africa. Communities of color bear a disproportionate share of the risks and health effects caused by radiation released during mining and milling. Milled uranium must be enriched and fabricated into fuel. NSP was a partner in an electric utility consortium that planned a uranium enrichment plant. The site they chose was next to two communities that are 97% African American near Homer, Louisiana. Fortunately, people in these communities educated and organized themselves in time to defeat the plant. In the process, federal regulators found probable cause that the consortium practiced institutional racism while siting the plant. The Prairie Island Mdewakanton Dakota community never had a voice in the decision to have a nuclear neighbor. The tribe was a ward of the federal government at the time. The Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of Interior had no problem with accommodating the nuclear industry. The tribe was told it would be a steam plant. Yucca Mountain is sacred land to the Western Shoshone. Development of this repository violates the 1863 Treaty of Ruby Valley. So-called low-level dump sites are next to Hispanic communities near Sierra Blanca in Texas and the Colorado River tribes near Ward Valley, California. The Canadian government wants to store high-level waste on Cree and Dene lands in Saskatchewan. NSP is the lead utility in consortiums that attempted first to dump nuclear waste on the Mescalero Apache in New Mexico and now on the Skull Valley Band of Goshutes in Utah. 17 of 20 potential sites for federal interim storage of high-level waste were on Native American tribal lands. Anything is cheap if you don't pay the cost. Nuclear power cannot pay its own liability insurance. Taxpayers, not private money, developed nuclear technology. Nuclear waste management costs are incalculably high, but hardly assessed. Public health and environment costs are not counted. If these costs were counted, energy consumers could not afford nuclear power. Nuclear power can be phased out. Across the continent, many reactors have already been shut down because of maintenance costs and liabilities. Between August 1996 and March 1998, 5 reactors have permanently shut down. Big Rock Point in northern Michigan, Haddam Neck in Connecticut, Maine Yankee and Zion 1 and 2 in Illinois. Across the border, Ontario Hydro announced the closing of 7 nuclear plants. At least 10 more plants are on the bubble in terms of closing before the year 2000. Minnesota is 4 years into the 10-year Prairie Island phase-out program and has already brought online or committed to enough alternative energy to replace about half of the electricity produced on Prairie Island. Now we must stay the course for a renewable energy future.